Well, hello there, and thanks for joining Uncomplicated Math today. Today we're going to be looking at how to compare decimals, and by the end of this video, you'll know the steps involved when comparing decimals. So let's get started. So in question number 1, we're being asked to compare the decimals 8/10ths and 38/100ths. So looking over to the right-hand side here under our steps involved, we can see that our first step is to line up the decimals. And in brackets, we see the term place value. And the reason that that place value term is there is because whenever you're comparing decimals, you have to make sure that you're lining up the place values properly so that we can actually compare those decimals. Because you can't just compare the size of decimals because a longer decimal doesn't necessarily mean that that has a greater value. So for step number 1, let's get started by lining up our decimals. So we have 8/10ths, and we also have 38/100ths. So as you can see, we've lined up our decimal and each number is in their correct place values. So we can move on to step number 2, which is to add placeholders. And we can see here that we have an empty space after we've lined up our decimals. We're missing a number in our hundredths place. So if we find that we have an empty space like this, after aligning our decimals properly, we can add a placeholder 0. And we can do this because when you add a 0 to the right of a decimal, it doesn't change the value of that decimal. So adding a placeholder 0 like this allows us to properly align our decimals so that we can compare them in our last step. And our last step is to compare the decimals place value to place value from left to right. And we compare the decimals from left to right because the numbers to the left of the decimal have the greatest value. So let's go ahead and jump right into step number 3, where we're going to compare the numbers on the far left. And we can see here that our furthest left number is our ones place, and both of these numbers have a value of 0. So we're going to move from left to right, and we're going to compare the numbers now in our tenths place. And as we can see here, 8 is greater than 3, so we know that 8/10ths is greater than 38/100ths. So now let's go ahead and move on to question number 2, where we're being asked to compare the decimals 300ths and 31,000ths. So our first step is to line up our decimals, so we have 300ths, and we also have 31,000ths. So now that we've lined up our decimals, making sure that each number is falling within its correct place value, we can move on to step number 2, which is to add our placeholder zeros. And we see that we have an empty space here in our thousandths place, so we're going to add a 0 to the thousandths place. And now we can move on to our last step, which is to compare the decimals from left to right. And we can see in the ones place that they're both the same value, so we can move to the tenths place. And once again, they have the same value, so we're moving on to our hundredths place. And in our hundredths place, we can see that they have the same value as well. So we need to move into our thousandths place in order to properly compare these decimals. And we can see here that 1 has a value that's greater than 0. So 300ths is less than 31,000ths. So now let's move on to question number 3, where we're being asked to compare 6 and 71/100ths to 6 and 72,000ths. So our first step was to line up the decimals. So we have 6 and 71/100ths, and we're comparing that to 6 and 72,000ths. We can see that we have an empty space, so for step number 2, we're going to add our placeholder 0, and now we're going to compare from left to right. And we can see that we have the same value in our ones place, so we're going to move on and compare the numbers in our tenths place. And we can see here that we have a 7 and a 0, and 7 obviously has a value that's greater than 0, so 6 and 71/100ths is greater than 6 and 72,000ths. So now let's go ahead and move on to question number 4, where we're being asked to compare 3 and 1600ths to 3 and 160,000ths. So step number 1 is to line up the decimals, making sure that the numbers are falling within their correct place value. So we have 3 and 1600ths, And now we have 3 and 160 thousandths. So now that we've lined up our decimals, making sure that each number is falling into the correct place value, we're going to add our placeholder 0 to our empty space in the thousandths place. So now that we look to compare from left to right, it's pretty obvious that these decimals have the same value. So 3 and 16 hundredths is equal to 3 and 160 thousandths. So hopefully by now you understand how to compare decimals. Help make math less complicated by smashing those like and subscribe buttons. As always, enjoy today's math journey.